Hi and welcome to Spooky Hours. My name's David Saunderson, and today we're talking to Dr. Peter McCue, who we've had here a couple of times at the Spooky Hours, and we've spoken to him previously about some of his most recent books involving haunted highways and haunted forests. But today I wanted to talk to him about an issue that he wrote about in a book from back in 2012, where he spoke about phantom battles, in particularly Loch Ashie, which is a place in the north of Scotland, which is quite near Inverness. Now, Peter, Loch Ashie is a what we know as sort of a phantom battlefield. Is that what you would call it? When I say phantom, it's a haunted, a place where people see battles being played out in the supernatural sense.
Yeah, the loch is it's associated with a range of alleged or reported phenomena. They fall into three categories, I'd say. One, the main category perhaps, would be reports of suggesting a phantom battle or phantom warriors. The second phenomenon is sightings of a phantom car in that area. And the third category, I would say, miscellaneous apparitions, not the car and not necessarily phantom soldiers, including, for instance, phantom dogs and or single or other human apparitions.
Is there anything? But I mean, the book that I was referring to before, I think it's called Zones of Strangeness.
Yes.
So obviously we're saying Loch Ashie is a zone of strangeness, because it seems that if there's a number of apparition sightings, and they all seem quite a little bit weird, what is it about the place that's lent itself to that?
Well, the reports of the phantom battle go back a long time. In fact, according to one source, early source I looked at, go back to antiquity, which suggests hundreds of years. And there have been scattered reports of people experiencing this sort of phantom activity. I must say, though, that as far as I'm aware, nothing has been reported recently. And even in its heyday of the phantom battle sightings, if they were truly occurring and it's more than just folklore, they may have been quite scattered in time. When you're reporting on a case, you can say you can maybe report X number of incidents, but it's worth bearing in mind they may be scattered over a very long period of time.
When you say a heyday, when was the heyday of this of the sightings?
Well, I think in the 19th century there were supposedly some sightings, including a very dramatic one of a man passing through the area and seeing thousands of troops on either side fighting one another. Some of the reports, though, suggest something much earlier. One report that came to me from a woman who lived in Inverness, a Dr. June Barnes, who moved down to Cumbria, and her father owned a shop in Inverness. And when she was a schoolgirl, she came home one lunchtime, probably about 1944 or 1945, and her father was talking to a shepherd. And the shepherd had apparently asked her father whether there was there been any local battles. And he told the father, and June Barnes overheard some of this conversation, that he'd been minding his sheep near Loch Ashie when a mist had come down, and he'd seen sort of ragged looking warriors, dirty, badly dressed men, running or going towards the sound of battle. And the man the shepherd was allegedly quite scared and hid behind a boulder or rock. The warriors didn't seem to see him, and he wasn't sure how long this vision lasted, but eventually the sun came out again and the mist dispersed and things returned to normal.
Okay. When you say that they were ragged, what does that mean? Do we think that they were sort of like, I don't know, last couple of hundred years, and they might have been some kind of Celtic warriors or Jacobites, or what
possibly earlier than that? I mean, it could even be that this is something going back to the time of the Picts, maybe sort of, the 300 AD, between then and say 1000 AD. It could be something like that. The trouble is, there's no historical record of any major battle in that very specific
I was going to
locality.
ask you that. That's interesting. So
Yeah.
it's
The
not.
nearest one I should say is 8 miles to the northeast, roughly. The Battle of Culloden, which was
Yeah.
the last major battle on British soil, and that was fought in 1746. That saw the end of the Jacobite cause, really, when the government forces under the Duke of Cumberland defeated Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. But that was, as I say, some miles away.
That has its own. I mean, I've got a book on my bookshelf as a child, and I think that's about Culloden and a ghostly battle that someone sees there. So
Yes.
I mean, I think probably all battlefields around Britain have their own connected sightings of the paranormal.
Yes.
So if it's so far away and there's nothing there, why do we think we're seeing something, or were we seeing something at Loch Ashie?
Well, one possibility is that there were clashes that weren't recorded. You can imagine that was the time, going back to, I say, the time of the Picts, when there were incursions by Vikings. Raiding parties might come ashore, and there may have been battles or small scale battles between, say, the Vikings and the native Picts inhabiting the area at the time. Another possibility, I suppose, is there may have been some sort of internal clan conflicts within the resident population. Another possibility is that some of these stories are folkloric inventions, and people have added to them mischievously and misreported and so on.
Okay, well, let's assume they're real, just for the sake that someone did see something. What is your view though? Like, I mean, we always talk about ghosts within houses, of walking through walls, or people seeing phantoms around the place, but that's usually like a one-off thing. That's like a one person. I've seen a ghost. I've not seen a group of ghosts doing something as much as an action. What do you think of that generally as a concept?
I would suggest that there may be no difference. That one way of looking at these things is to say that a ghostly experience is a drama. It's a kind of apparitional drama, and whether it involves a dog, one man, or 20 men, it may essentially be the same thing. In other words, it may be wrong to think of the individual apparitions making up the performance as say, spirits. So if you've got 20 ghosts appearing in a battle, to think it's 20 spirits and each one is producing an apparition. It may be that something else is going on, and whether it's one or whether it's 20 or whether it's 200 even, it may be essentially the same process. I mean, one theory that I'm sure you're aware of is that ghostly events, or some ghostly events, are kind of replays of events that have somehow left some sort of impression, either on the place itself, a sort of recording, a bit like a video recording that's somehow played back, or that's made some kind of impression on a collective mind. So if it's the collective memory of people living in the area that there was some sort of battle in the past, maybe that collective memory can be activated in certain circumstances. And the problem with that is, why does a reactivated memory produce hallucinations? I mean, you and I might remember times when we we're young and certain experiences happen, but we don't suddenly see the things happening. We can distinguish clearly between memory and our ongoing perception.
I just wonder whether it's something like, okay, I don't see it, but I feel it.
Yep.
And people mistake feeling, like emotions and stuff, and it becomes a visual thing. Like you didn't actually see that happening, you just felt whatever was going on around you. When you can walk into a room and there's something not quite right going on. It might be that they're there and there's something not quite right going on, and they mistake that feeling for sight. I don't know, that's just a thought I have.
Well, if you take some of the reports at face value, there seems to be more to it than that. I mean, one case, for instance, was drawn to my attention by a contact called Andy Beaton. In fact, it was Andy who drew my attention to the Loch Ashie phenomena in the first place. And he was addressed by a woman in 1999 who said that her brother had had a couple of odd experiences at Loch Ashie, and she was asking whether there had been a battle there. And the brother had fished at Loch Ashie since childhood, and he'd had two experiences there. One of them, he was on a boat on the loch fishing, and he heard voices from the shore. Couldn't make out whether they were in English or Gaelic or what language it was, but he could hear voices, and there was also a clashing sound, which gave him the impression of swords. Sword fighting. He didn't see anything, and this took him by surprise. I think, because he'd been there many times before, and he felt somewhat disturbed and cut that day's fishing to a stop. The other experience he had at the loch, he was fishing from the shore. This didn't involve any kind of battle theme as such, but he looked to his side and saw a figure with seemed to be a long cloak coming in his direction. He returned his gaze to his fishing rod, and when he looked back again, there was nothing there.
Okay.
Another case that does, sorry to interrupt you, but one case that fits with what you were saying earlier, another informant was a man called Jim Feggans, who visited the loch with a friend for the purposes of fishing again, and they went there one evening and they abandoned the trip because they got a distinct feeling, or Jim got the distinct feeling, that they would suddenly overstepped the mark in some way and they weren't welcome. And he also got the impression that he had a puncture had occurred in his car, which they'd driven down a track. And when they got back to the car, indeed, there was a puncture. And he felt too anxious to fix the puncture there. He drove back along the track nearer to the road before he felt comfortable enough to get out and change the wheel. Now, in that case, it was all about feelings and impressions, as you were saying earlier, rather than something visual or auditory.
Is this something that happens on other lochs around Scotland? I mean, obviously there's Loch Ness, and that's a monster, and that's a completely different issue. But is there something about lakes that is a bit more spooky? Like we were talking before about sort of the recording of, the sort of the stone tape theory about recording things that have happened in the past. Can big bits of water do that?
A case that comes to mind is one in Angus in 1950. A woman was been to a party, I think around Christmas time. Her car broke down, and she then got out and walked the remaining distance home to a village called Letham. And as she was walking home, she saw figures, strange figures, and it seemed to be an apparitional experience she was having. I think they were carrying torches, and this was an area where there had been a battle years ago between the Picts and the invading Northumbrians, and the Northumbrians were defeated. And it's been suggested that what this woman saw was a sort of replay of the Picts burying their dead after the battle. And there had been a loch there. It was called Nechtanesmere, and I think it had subsequently dried up. But there wasn't. You could say there was an association there with the loch, assuming this experience was what it seemed to be.
Yeah, that's a good question though. You're saying that they're burying their dead. Why would that be a ghostly thing? I mean, I can understand the terror of the actual fighting being a very emotional thing, but why see something like that? I'm just wondering. When you always, what makes a ghostly scene?
Well, I suppose if you're associating emotion with, you're assuming that, or if one assumes that emotion plays a role in the creation of a recording, if there is a process of recording in the first place, burying the dead would still be perhaps an emotional experience. It may not be the same as thinking that any moment you're going to have a sword slithering through your ribs or you're going to be killed. The battle's now over and your side has won, but you may have lost close comrades and so on. And there may be a mixture of strong emotions of relief and exuberance of having defeated the enemy, but great sadness of having lost close comrades, or even possibly family members.
So how does that work with a car? Like you've done lots of, you wrote a book about it, about highways, but what's emotional about a car driving down a road?
Well, a lot of these cases where there are phantom cars and so on, it's hard to identify any specific originating event. It's not a ghosts of folklore. Of course, there would be a nice, neat explanation. Joe and Mary were driving along. They had a tragic accident on the eve of their wedding, and ever since then, their the car is seen. So there's a kind of explanation there in a sense, but with many, some of these ghostly car reports, people don't know who was in the car or what it was. I was in touch with a woman recently called Sheena Aspinall, who had an experience in North Wales, and in her case, she and a friend did see a phantom car years ago, and it does seem that in that case there had been a possible originating event. A car of I don't know that colour, it may have even been the same colour, had an accident. It may have been a fatal accident, I can't remember, but that case, perhaps there was a triggering incident that could be identified, but in other cases it's not clear.
Okay. Now, we've been talking about battlefield ghosts or battlefield phantoms and all this, or whatever we want to call them. There's lots of them around Britain. One that comes to my name is Edge Hill. Can you tell us a little bit about that one? And I know you've got some thoughts about whether the validity of that case.
Yeah, if you look at books on British ghosts, you'll find many reports or many references in popular books on ghosts to apparitional replays of the Battle of Edge Hill. The Battle of Edge Hill was fought in 1642. It was the first major clash of the English Civil War, and it was fought near a village called Kyneton in Warwickshire in the Midlands. And according to a couple of pamphlets published weeks after the battle, there were apparitional replays, or reenactments, as it were, of the battle. Now, the two pamphlets don't describe the events identically. There are differences between them. And some years ago, maybe about 17 years ago, a colleague, Dr. Alan Gould, and I dug into this case. We did quite a bit of historical research to see whether the evidence supported the claims, and we actually didn't turn up any corroborating evidence. For instance, according to these two pamphlets, the minister in Kyneton at the time was a Samuel Marshall, but we discovered that the vicar at Kyneton at that time was actually a Richard Fisher, and we didn't come across any evidence suggesting that a Samuel Marshall had stood in for Fisher temporarily. Imagine, for instance, that Fisher had been unwell and someone had stood in for him temporarily. We didn't find any evidence of that. According to the pamphlets, the King Charles I, got to hear of the apparitional events and sent a delegation to investigate the phenomena, and very dramatically, the delegation themselves witnessed the phenomena. Now, in the pamphlets, you can see some of these alleged commission members are named. So we looked into this. We looked at records pertaining to these men who were named and royal records, and found no confirmation at all that such a commission had been sent to Kyneton, and no confirmation that these men had participated in such an event, such a royal commission. So our conclusion, having gone into it in some depth, was that the reported events may be fictitious. What may have happened is that authors have read about the case, have always assumed that someone else has checked the facts, and once a case gets reported, one might think, oh well, someone must have checked it out. It must be true. And I must admit, I think I first was aware of this case when I was a child. And I assumed it was true. I thought this is a very dramatic and impressive case. But when you look into it, it doesn't sort of hold up. There's another one I'll just mention very briefly in the Lake District of the hill called Sauter Fell, where in the 18th century, there was reportedly a sighting or series of sightings, depending on which source you look at, of an army maneuvering on this hill, which is about 1,700 feet high. But the trouble is, this was another case that Gould and I looked into in some depth. There are two early historical sources, and they differ quite quite importantly, one source refers to just one sighting in 1744, and the other one mentions three sightings: 1735, 1737, and 1745. So quite significant differences. Again, we didn't find any strong corroborating evidence.
Well, just back to the Edge Hill stuff, because I mean, I just want to focus on that because that's obviously really quite famous. What do you think the purpose would have been originally to make up a tale like that?
Well, I think it was known to be a fact that people in those times would publish pamphlets for political or maybe religious propaganda reasons. Or maybe to express their displeasure at the very fact that there was a civil war. I must say, having looked at the pamphlets, read both of them, it's not clear to me how either of them is particularly taking one side or the other, between the parliamentary side or the royalist side in the Civil War. But nevertheless, it was known that the pamphlets were in circulation or published around that time that would make false claims. So I don't think it's particularly remarkable, to think that these pamphlets were concoctions. They weren't representations of the truth. It could be that the pamphlets were based on some sort of vague rumours of the odd apparition being seen in the area, and then grossly, ramped up. It may even be that the second pamphlet, which was published just a matter of days after the first one, was to some extent modelled on the first. I don't know. Or it could even be, I suppose, that the same individual or individuals were behind both of them. I don't know.
Could just be a fantastic story, and they want to sell pamphlets.
Yes.
As simple as that. It's basically a ghost story which we all love, and they were giving you one and say, by the way, this is like news of the world type stuff, Civil War style. So,
yes.
Yeah. So what we're talking about a couple there that we think didn't happen. Well, that there's no much basis for. Do you have any other examples of ones that that you've got more confidence in that there might be something more to it?
Well, the one that as I say, that I've already mentioned it, is Loch Ashie. I mean, from the reports I've seen, the amount of first-hand evidence I've received about it is very limited. I mean, I was in touch with Jim Feggans, the man who went there fishing with a friend, and they felt sort of scared and came away. He seemed a sensible enough man, and no reason to think he was lying to me. Another person I was in touch with, Paul Hajnowski from Inverness, told me of what he thinks may have been an experience of the phantom vehicle. He was driving, he was being driven by his father to visit a friend. They were going down a small minor road. They stopped to ask for directions. Paul got out, went to a house to get directions, and he saw a car come up, the lights of a car come along the lane, and seemingly past, his father's car. And when he got back to the car, he said he asked the father about the car passing and how it got by, I think, and the father said he hadn't seen a car. So Paul thought this may have been tied in with the other reports. So in other words, a little bit of first-hand evidence which does suggest there may be some truth to the Loch Ashie case. June Barnes' report. I mean, June was quite taken by this story from the shepherd. I can't think of any obvious reason why a shepherd would wander into a shop in Inverness and ask questions of the shopkeeper, purely for the reasons of hoaxing. And the man who was reportedly fishing on the lake when he heard the clashing of swords, or what sounded like swords, he apparently was told at a fishing tackle shop in Inverness other people he mentioned his experiences, or at least one of them, and was told that other people had reported odd things at Loch Ashie. So, taking it in the round, I think that this may be a more substantial case than Edge Hill, although much less well known.
Well, anyway, I think that's right. But as I said at the start of this conversation, you've written about Loch Ashie in your Zones of Strangeness, an examination of paranormal and UFO hotspots. Now, that was published in 2012. I assume it's still available on Amazon, is it?
Yes,
it is. So I think that's one to definitely look at if you're interested in battlefield ghosts. And I think zones of strangeness, there obviously is something going on in that area that people are looking at, and I think it's something that we maybe might want to discuss at a later date with maybe some of the other strangeness zones around the UK. So anyway, thank you for that, Peter. We'll look forward to maybe talking to you next time about some of your research into the paranormal around Britain.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Peter.